So I wanted to get started with this reading vlog, even though I am a good chunk of the way already started with The Long Walk by Stephen King. I did start this a few days ago on, I think, Thursday or Friday, about the 29th or the 30th of October, but hadn't had really a chance to talk about this with anybody because, let alone you guys, because I was busy getting married over this past weekend. I wanted to get started on this reading vlog for The Long Walk, now about almost 50 pages in, just because I have some time now since I am on a break from work and have just finished the chapter I was working on. So, for those of you that don't know, Stephen King for a long time has been writing under the name Richard Bachman. I don't know if necessarily it was known early on that Richard Bachman was also Stephen King, but I know at the very least now anyone who knows Stephen King books knows that he writes also under the name Richard Bachman from time to time. So King's first book he ever wrote was back in 1974 with Carrie. So now we're going in about 5 years of writing when he first brings out his first book under the name Richard Bachman. Now I'm not 100% certain as to why he decided to start going under a pen name for The Long Walk, whether that was because, you know, he had already been so established in the last 5 years as being a certain type of writer, and Richard Bachman would be kind of a different kind of writing style, or any of the books that would be under Richard Bachman would be even more gruesome than what King has already written. I can say though within the first 50 pages it's not that different than how King writes his books when he's writing under his own name. I'm gonna actually look that up real quick because I would like to know and then share with you guys the information. So according to Wikipedia, let's just, you know, take this with a grain of salt. Sometimes Wikipedia is right, sometimes not. So let's take this all with a grain of salt. But according to Wikipedia, at the beginning of Stephen King's career, the general view among publishers was that an author was limited to one book per year, since publishing more would be unacceptable to the public. King therefore wanted to write under another name in order to increase his publication without oversaturating the market for the King brand. He convinced his publisher, Signet Books, to print novels under a pseudonym. Okay, so basically it was a marketing issue. Like, he wanted to push out more books, but because back in the 1970s, going into the 80s more so, there was not really a approvalness of there being more than one book by the same author being published in the same year. Nowadays, that's not the case. I know a lot of people, especially like in the YA community, they'll publish like a book and then maybe like a few months down the road there'll be like a prequel, or a lot of times the serialized novels, like where they're kind of more novella based in a sense, that they'll get pushed out within a few months of each other. Actually, now thinking about it, I do believe that Christopher Pike did that in the 90s, where like all of his Thirst books for the most part, I believe, were published like very, very quickly after each other. He stated that adopting the nom de plume, which is otherwise known as a pen name, was also an attempt to make sense out of his career and try to answer the question of whether his success was due to talent or luck. That's interesting because, yeah, I think that especially with him, like I said, having already been established as Stephen King in the first 5 years of his career, he wasn't probably certain whether or not he was, you know, doing well because his name was big enough, or if he really just got lucky. So that's interesting how with The Long Walk, he decided to go with another name to see if people just really liked what he was able to do under another name. He says he deliberately released the Bachman novels with as little marketing presence as possible and did his best to load the dice against Bachman. King concludes that he has yet to find an answer to the talent versus luck question, as he felt he was outed as Bachman too early to know. The Bachman book Thinner, published in 1984, sold 28,000 copies during its initial run, and then 10 times as many when it was revealed that Bachman was in fact King. The pseudonym King originally selected, which was Gus Pillsbury, is King's maternal grandfather's name, but at the last moment, due to the pseudonym being outed, King changed it to Richard Bachman. Richard is a tribute to crime author Donald E. Westlake's long-running pseudonym Richard Stark. The surname Stark was later used in King's novel The Dark Half, in which an author's malevolent pseudonym George Stark comes to life. Bachman was inspired by the Bachman-Turner Overdrive, a rock and roll band King was listening to at the time his publisher asked him to choose a pseudonym on the spot. He provided biographical details for Bachman, initially in the About the Author blurbs in the early novels. Known facts about Bachman were that he was born in New York, served a 4-year stint in the Coast Guard, which he then followed with 10 years in the Merchant Marine. Bachman finally settled down in rural central New Hampshire, where he ran a medium-sized dairy farm, writing at night. His 5th novel was dedicated to his wife, Claudia Inez Bachman, Bachman, who also received credit for the bogus author photo on the book jacket. Other facts about the author were revealed in publicity dispatches from Bachman's publishers. The Bachmans had one child, a boy who died in an unfortunate Stephen King-esque accident at the age of 6 when he fell through a well and drowned. In 1982, a brain tumor was discovered near the base of Bachman's brain. Tricky surgery removed it. After Bachman's true identity was revealed, later publicity dispatches and about the author blurbs revealed that Bachman died suddenly in late 1985 of cancer of the pseudonym, a rare form of schizophrenia. So basically, Richard Bachman in 1985 was killed off because everybody knew that Richard Bachman was Stephen King. Oh, okay, so Rage apparently was the first one that was under the name Bachman because apparently, it says here, King dedicated Bachman's early books, which were Rage from 1977, The Long Walk in 1979, Road Work in 1981, and The Running Man in 1982 to people close to him. So it seems like there was only 4 books that King had wrote under Bachman before he was killed off. And then it later says in this section that at the time of the announcement in 1985, King was working on Misery, which he had planned to release as a Bachman book, but now we know is under the name Stephen King. The link between King and his shadow writer was exposed after Steve Brown, a bookstore clerk in Washington, D.C., noticed similarities between the writing styles of King and Bachman. Yeah, like I said, the first 50 pages of this it seems very, very similar to King's writing. Like, there's almost no distinction between the two so far, so that doesn't surprise me that somebody would be like, hey, these seem pretty similar. Brown located publishers' records at the Library of Congress, which included a document naming King as the author of one of Bachman's novels. Brown wrote to King's publishers with a copy of the documents he had uncovered and asked them what to do. 2 weeks later, King telephoned Brown personally and suggested he write an article about how he discovered the truth, allowing himself to be interviewed. So he even got permission from King himself to out him, and it was kind of one of those things probably where he was like, well, somebody knows about it, so might as well just, announce it, because if he knows, people are going to figure it out pretty quickly, because it seems that it was a clear enough relationship between the way that King and Bachman both wrote their books. So anyway, I wanted to share that because I was honestly curious myself as to how exactly the name Richard Bachman came around, and 2, how exactly King was outed. I guess Rage was technically the first book under Bachman, but I was not able to read that because any copy I could find of Rage is upwards of like $1,000 to purchase, and I do not know if my local library might have it, because the local library that I would be able to access is not letting people in the building. They're still doing curbside pickup as far as I know, and I can't get a library card from them because basically they say you can apply for one, and then when the library actually opens up fully, then you can go in to get your library card and like actually go through that process. But as far as I know, they're not actually fully open as of yet. I believe they're still doing that curbside pickup, so I can't get Rage if they even have it. But let's go into a little bit about what The Long Walk is about to finish off this clip. So The Long Walk basically is about this kind of dystopian post-apocalyptic world of some kind. If you like the Hunger Games, you might kind of appreciate what this kind of does, because it's kind of the same deal. There's no clear reason as to why, at this point where I'm at in the book, as to how the world got to be where it is and why there is a competition basically happening that goes on every single year. But the competition basically is you get a bunch of 16-year-old boys, about 100 or so, and they all go on this competition called The Long Walk. It is televised. People can watch literally them walk down the streets past their houses, and the whole aim of it is to see which person can be the last man standing in this long walk. It doesn't stop. You're not allowed to go under 4 miles an hour. You get 3 warnings, and then if you get more than that, you get what's called a ticket, which is not really a ticket. It's explained very early on that basically you're killed off. But the last man standing basically gets the ultimate prize, which is anything that they desire. For a lot of them, it's money for their homes. A lot of them, it's basically a way for them to get out of poverty, unfortunately, which leads me to believe that this is a world where there's a lot more poverty that is more known about than there is in our world. Like, we understand that there's a poverty line that a lot of people are under, but we are not in a society where we basically take our impoverished individuals and pit them against each other to be able to see who deserves money more than the rest of them, kind of thing. So we follow our main character, whose name he goes by Garrity. That's his last name, and I believe his first name is Ray. And basically we're following him as he is a contestant in the long walk and seeing how this whole competition plays out, and hopefully see whether or not he actually wins the competition. So like I said, if you like The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins and kind of like that idea of seeing a post-apocalyptic some kind of world where there's a competition involved and people are basically fighting to the death in a sense, this would be something I would recommend because it's kind of got some similar vibes to it. However, it's not a fight to the death. It is just literally a bunch of boys walking until they die. It's very interesting so far. I do, like I said, do see a lot of the similarities in the writing style between King and Bachman, which makes it very, very apparent to me how he would have been outed. It doesn't really surprise me at all that somebody was very easily able to see the similarities between King and Bachman. It seems very apparent to me that they're the same person because the writing style is almost the exact same. So like I said, I just got to about 47 pages of it. I'm currently in part 2, which is called Going Down the Road. The one thing I will say about this that I think a lot of people would be kind of not okay with necessarily is that the chapters are quite long. The first chapter I think was like 26 pages. So that's a pretty common thing, though. I think that a lot of times, especially with Stephen King's novels, like his full-fledged novels, which we saw like in The Stand, we saw in like several other books that he had come out that were full-fledged novels, his chapters are long, which is a big reason why a lot of people don't really seem to like him as an author. They don't like that he has longer chapters, but this book by itself is 391 pages, so weird enough, as long as the chapters are, you kind of feel like you're flying through them because I think you're very enraptured with what the whole thing is and seeing like how people go through this competition. Like they're provided food and water and they're able to get, you know, more supplies of that nature, but they can't stop walking. They can't stop moving forward. I don't know necessarily at this point if it'll be a 5-star for me, but right now it's not awful by any means. I like it. I just haven't got far enough in the story to really give much of an opinion on it, whether or not it's good or it's bad or kind of somewhere in the middle. So I think what I will do is next time I update you, I will be about 100 pages or so through the book and then kind of hopefully have a little bit more of an opinion on it, and we'll kind of see where it goes from there. Hello everyone, it is the next day. It is November 3rd. I am currently on my lunch and I wanted to quickly check in with you guys on the long walk. So far, yesterday I only read about 21 pages. It's not that I wasn't in a good reading mood, I just kind of got preoccupied with a couple of different things. I started watching the old TV series of The Stand, like the ones that were like 1-hour episodes basically, and there was only 4 of them that came out in like 1994. Had like Gary Sinise in it, Molly Ringwald, a couple other people. And so far with that, I'm not sure how I feel about it because they basically took a bunch of characters, or they took 2 characters, I should say, and put them into one person. I really hate when writers for movies do that. However, Stephen King was supposedly one of the writers for the show. So I don't know, maybe it was because they felt that there was no point in having this other character because the character that they meshed with one of the larger characters was like pretty insignificant, which it would make sense, but I'm still kind of irked about that because basically what ended up happening was they took this character away from this other pretty important character that comes up during the story, and it just kind of messed everything up. Like, it messed up the whole flow of the story for me in terms of the movie. But I kid you not, probably the first like half hour of the movie are pretty much verbatim from the book, so that was exciting to see. So far that one's going okay. We watched the first 2 parts of that last night. I think I'm gonna probably, hopefully, enjoy the new TV series coming out in December a lot more, because I have a lot of high hopes for that considering the casting of that series. So anyway, with The Long Walk, like I said, I read about 21 pages of this yesterday because I spent a lot of time watching The Stand last night. So far today though, I have got quite a bit of it read. I started on page 48, 49. And I'm currently on page 99, so I'm already 50 pages in just from reading on my breaks today. It's slow, but it's not slow at the same time, because literally the whole thing is watching this whole competition going on. They can't really like interfere with each other. They can't have other people on the outside interfere with them. Like, they can't get anything from the outside. They basically just only get what they get. They do get like canteens refilled, and every day at about 9 a.m. they will get like a little bit more concentrated food so they can eat as they're walking, but it's pretty much like a non-stop walking kind of thing. It's not really ever told though why exactly this whole thing started, and that's kind of one of the big drawbacks I think I've seen so far. But it is possible that with the next almost 200, almost 300 pages of this book, that it will come up. But at the moment, everything is so very present that we don't really get a lot of outside information. There's a lot of characters that talk about, past things, but they don't talk about necessarily what led them to this point, because everything is very much in the present. You're very much thrown into this world and you don't know what's happening, so you don't get really any background on anything. Heavy trigger warnings for a lot of death, a lot of young people getting shot and killed, because basically, as I've said before, if you don't adhere to the rules, you will basically be what's called given a ticket, but that only really means you're just basically being killed as you are participating in this. So if you go below 4 miles an hour, if you stop, if you do something that basically interferes with other people, or you take outside influence, or anything like even just a drink of water from the outside that is not regulated by the actual military that is running this, you're basically dead. Like, that's it. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. No questions. They will shoot you literally like right then and there, and you can't escape from it. They don't necessarily even give a time, like whether or not this is actually like in the future, but the way that this is set up is it's supposed to be kind of a near distant future kind of thing, where it's like a fairly, comparable time period to any time that you're reading it, but it's supposed to be kind of a futuristic sense where, like, obviously this isn't happening now, but it could happen at some point in the future kind of thing, similar to how most dystopian kind of stories are, where it's like it's not necessarily happening now but could happen in the future, and it may be nearer than we think, but it's still far off to where we don't know when it would happen kind of thing. I like it. I think it's not necessarily bad. Like, I don't have any major qualms with it at this point, but I also am kind of like still not quite sure how I feel about it, because I'm only now just about 100 pages in and I am only on chapter 5. So I don't know what I think is going to happen. I have a feeling though Garrity might team up with at least one of the other boys in this, because there's one character, McVry, that he seems to kind of get along with pretty well, and McVry kind of keeps making this thing where he's like, he's not trying to help the other people, but he's also trying to get them to, like, stay alive as long as they can kind of thing, and they all kind of provide this weird comic relief. The one thing I will say about King is, like, I feel like his humor in a lot of his books is very kind of just strange. Like, they talk a lot about, these different things. They always rag on each other for, like, a bunch of sexual stuff. I don't know what it is, though. There's, like, so much that, like, there's random things that these characters will say in any of his books, at least from the very beginning of what I've seen of him. Like, I feel like with Salem's Lot, it was like this, with The Shining, with definitely The Stand, and with this one, where characters try to be funny, but the things that they say don't necessarily make any meaning or they don't have any sense to them. So I don't know if that's a product of like the late 70s and that was kind of the humor that you would see, where like today we would see it and it makes complete no sense, but somebody from the 70s would be like, oh yeah, that was actually really funny back then. Or if King is just a fucking wackadoo and nothing of what these characters say makes sense, which would actually make quite a bit of sense considering that I'm fairly certain that in the 70s when he first started writing, he was heavily into drugs and alcohol, so it's possible that a lot of his writing has this weird kind of feeling to it, and the characters say these weird things that we don't understand because King thought it was funny in his drugged up, alcohol-infused mind, and nobody thought to change it. So anyway, those kind of my general thoughts right now with the first 100 pages. I just feel like, you know, it's good. I just don't have any major like qualms with it, but I also don't have any major like shining pieces of it that I feel like need to be talked about. I think I just would like to see something, you know, at this point in the book, anything to do with like how exactly America in this world got to how it is, because I think it would help explain a lot about like why the long walk happens, because we learn about in like the Hunger Games with Panem that there was like a big uprising, and because the government wanted to punish the people for that uprising, for that resistance, they then created the Hunger Games. The next time I'm going to update you guys is probably when I get to about 200 pages. I feel like that's a pretty good benchmark. I don't know if I'll get to it today. I might, depending on how the day goes, but we shall see.
Like a bird on a tree, I'm just sitting here. I got time, it's clear to see. From up here, the world seems small. We can sit together. It's so beautiful, you and me. We meant to be in the great outdoors, forever free. Sometimes you need to go and take a step back to see the truth around you. From a distance you can tell. You and me, we're meant to be in the great outdoors, forever free. You and me.
Well, surprise, surprise, I actually got dressed today, and I'm all bundled up in a heated blanket because even though it's going to be like 60 degrees, nearly 70 degrees here in Michigan for like the next week, I'm freezing in my house. Like, it's freaking cold. But anyway, so I have reached page 263 of The Long Walk. I am on chapter 11 right now. Yesterday I read about 71 pages, and the day before I had read a total of 100 and some, I think, over the course of the day. It's been a pretty good couple reading days so far, and just today already I have read about 42 pages, so we're off to a good start. It's about just after 11 o'clock in the morning. I don't have a lot of work going on today, so I think I'm gonna just, you know, obviously split my time with trying to continue to work as much as I can, even though there isn't really a lot, and obviously like I normally do reading. But yeah, so okay, here we are about 250 more than pages in. By the way, if you hear any pounding in the background, we are getting the siding fixed on our house. like that, because a few days ago we had some of our siding come off because it was super, super windy. So that's getting fixed right now and has been getting fixed all morning so far. In terms of the long walk, I think this is a good story. I think that in general, it's a really interesting premise, but I feel like this is definitely something where a lot of people, when they go to read it, are going to be like, what the fuck is this? Because a lot of this, I think, had probably been written while Stephen King was on drugs, because there's so many conversations that go on with the story that don't seem to make sense. Like they just seem like really strange conversations to be having. And don't get me wrong, this is a strange world by all means. Like it's freaky. Even then, a lot of the conversations just seem to be completely like out of left field. They don't make sense. Some characters seem really psychotic, more so than I think they normally would be in actual real life. But again, knowing Stephen King's drug abuse that he had done in the past, it makes sense that a lot of these characters and things that come up seem very strange, almost alien-like, because it's not normally what we would see in any kind of way that a normal author would write these. So I think that if you're going into this, you have to know, for one, it's very slow, because you're literally just following a group of guys going down a road for however many miles until 99 of them die, and then you're left with one left. And then two, you also have to know that the conversations that go on with this are kind of crazy. I think in general the book itself is fine. I think it's good. It definitely explores a lot about, the human capacity to, continue on in this way and survive in a sense where like you're going 100% almost the whole time, and how long does it take before, somebody finally cracks physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all those things. And you really see in this too how like a lot of the characters that are in this walk, they're constantly like questioning everything. Like they are questioning the reasons why they're doing this. They're questioning kind of their own morality and their own psychology, because several of them don't really think that they know why they're involved with this, but they feel like they've been dealt with such a bad life for a long time that this is all they can do, because the prize is supposed to be anything they desire, which could be monetary, it could be pretty much anything that they could think of, and that for some reason is the only hope that a lot of these characters have, because they've been dealt with a bad hand. They've dealt with a lot of things in their life that have like basically run them to the ground to where they feel hopeless. They don't feel like that they contribute much to society anymore, and so this is the only way they feel like they can actually contribute is to the entertainment of everybody else with this yearly competition. Ray Garrity is a little bit different, where I feel like he has a real reason as to why he wants to do this. I think he wants to win the money for his family, but that's the thing, is you don't really know anyone's real motivations with this. You just know that it seems that a lot of them have had some kind of bad deal, and so they kind of, maybe it's that they go into this thinking that they can win something from it, but nobody really gives a full-on background of why they are going into this. Some of them just are like, it's for the fun of it, it's for the hell of it, knowing though that if they fail, they will likely die, because if they, get kicked out of the game, they get shot and killed. So I don't really necessarily know if there is any particular reason as to why a lot of them are there. I don't think that it's necessarily as big of an issue as I think most people would think, where like that's not expressed why these characters are here. We just all understand that these characters that are in this, like you learn about them a little bit more as the story goes on in different ways, but I feel like a lot of the characters that are involved in this long walk, the common thing with them is that they feel like there's nothing else that they can do, and they feel like this is the only way that they're able to actually make some kind of impression in the world, whether it's because they want to compete to win the prize, whether it's to provide entertainment for the world for this competition that happens every year. Like they basically just don't have any other option when it comes to living, and so they feel like this is the way that they have to go. In this kind of a situation, how does one survive when it seems like everything is lost, everything is hopeless? Like how do you go on in this particular competition specifically, where you're literally walking until you die? How do you continue with all of that, knowing that you likely will not finish the whole competition, and the fact that you're putting basically your life on the line to have a chance at winning something, not necessarily winning it, but having a chance at winning something? Like how do you go about that? And I think it also, like I said, talks a lot about the human condition of the body, where how does it continue on when you physically are not able to, but when you mentally have to continue going? Like, how does the mind and the body work together in order to get through this kind of a scenario? I think it's just a very interesting look at this. One of the reviews on here calls it a psychological terror, which I think is very close to what this is. It's not so much like a mystery thriller of any kind or a horror book. It's very much a psychological thriller, because this is all about how the human brain is able to cope, and how it's able to kind of persevere in this very, very dark time, and how it's able to go through this entire problem of going through this competition, and how does the mind then affect the body. Like, they talk about mind over matter in a lot of ways when it comes to going through physical ailments, and how if you have a kind of more positive outlook, sometimes you are more likely to heal better, because you have put your mind over the pain that you are feeling. That's a way to end a chapter. I have 61 pages left until this is done. Should be done today. I'm on chapter 15 out of 18, so I've got about 4 chapters. I think I can probably get this done before the end of my workday today, but we're gonna see, just because it depends on how the workday really goes. Okay, so it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Finally finished the long walk. Guess let's talk about it here, because I don't feel like trying to set up my whole thing to be in front of my bookshelf. Okay, so I'm not going to spoil the ending for this, because I try to, with my Stephen King reading vlogs, not really have any spoilery content. I try to, at the very least, because I want people to be able to go through and read these books themselves and stuff like that. But what I'm going to say is, I think that this book is a 4-star for me. I really like it. I really like a lot of what it was going for, but I feel like sometimes, like I said before, the writing was very strange. Dialogue was bizarre, all these things, but this ending, holy fucking shit, this ending. I'm reeling. I'm also partially reeling from watching the end of Little Hope that I watched. I watched a playthrough by Gab Smolders, so still reeling from that, like seeing like one of the endings for it that like blew my mind. So, it's carrying over into this a little bit, but the ending by itself with The Long Walk, it's sad, it's tragic, like absolutely tragic, and what exactly happens to the main character. It's one of those moments where like you don't realize what exactly happened until you sit back and are kind of like relaxed, and then it kind of comes to you, like it bubbles up and comes to you, and you're like, oh, that's what happens. What I will say about this too is I feel like I said before, it is very slow. This is a very slow moving book because you're watching these characters go through this grueling walk to pretty much their own deaths. Like, it's heartbreaking. It's kind of traumatizing in a lot of ways, because the more you learn about these characters as they kind of like talk about stuff about, you know, the competition and how they're going to do and all these things, like you basically realize that this competition is pulling people that almost have nothing to live for, or they're doing this as a last resort because they feel like they don't have any other purpose in life, kind of thing. Like our main character Ray, he has a girlfriend that we learn about fairly early on. He has a family that he still has to go with, and so a lot of people that get drafted into this like do this for the money, because at the end of it, if they win, they get to have like this big prize, which can include money for their families and all of that. But it seems that Ray is doing this for a completely different reason, and we don't really ever know why. We don't know the full reason as to why any of the boys involved in this are doing it. But we do find out partway through that there is some kind of government control over who does the long walk and who has to participate. It's kind of got this like draft element to it almost. But there also is the ability to opt out, I guess. Like, you can say you're not going to do it, but there's like so much that goes on in this book. It doesn't really delve much into the world that it's in. Like, obviously it's kind of like a fairly near futuristic almost kind of thing, but just distant enough to where like we're not doing this anytime soon, but it's very possible this could happen. You have to go into it very open-minded. You're going to find a lot more about it, and kind of just these conversations of like, what is it going to take for someone to win something, and how far are people willing to go to win things, and how, you know, does the human condition work in terms of a physically grueling competition like the long walk. It talks a lot about the idea of like mind over matter, and how Ray in particular goes through this entire competition having to rely on that. He has little bits of food and he has water, but he has to actually use his mind over his body in order for him to continue on in this walk that's non-stop. There's so many rules involved with it. They can't have any outside help. They have to go within a certain speed limit, and basically they're just otherwise walking to an inevitable death, because many of them do not survive because their bodies give out on them, and then because their bodies give out on them, they're then eliminated from the game, literally and figuratively. Like, they're killed. Like, it's very early on we see that this happens. I think, like I said earlier, it's definitely a psychological terror. Like, almost, I would even say it's psychological horror in a lot of ways, because it's absolutely terrifying what goes on in this. There's no monsters, there's no supernatural elements. This is just pure physical exertion to the point where people are dying left and right. Like, there's nothing other than that. And it also goes into like the human psyche and how we have to like really in these kinds of situations protect ourselves. But it also talks about how when you're in this kind of situation, you're fighting with these other people, like you can create kinds of friendships, and then those friendships are so hard because you're seeing these people die left and right, and how difficult it is to feel like you want to continue when the people around you that are all going through the same thing you are all dropping like flies. I think this is definitely something that like when you go into Stephen King, you probably wouldn't expect, because a lot of people expect, you know, the supernatural horror almost with like Salem's Lot, Pet Sematary, all these things, but you don't really get to see very much how King writes psychological horror. Like, he does it fairly well. I think that, you know, most people, like I said, like see him as the supernatural writer, with even like Carrie and The Stand, like how in a lot of ways too, even his writing goes into kind of this philosophical and theological like talk. Whereas this is kind of like his first psychological horror he's ever written that's purely just focused on psychology and the human condition. And it's fascinating because I think that with him having written this under his name Bachman, that's a big reason why he probably would have wanted to write this, because if he had it under Bachman, it probably would sell a little bit better than he would if he was under King, because I think that if he had published this under his actual name King and people read it, they would be very confused as to how King was able to write this, because that's not what they knew at this point of his writing. And so maybe this was kind of more of his experimental work that he was trying to see and test the waters with, which I think is a great idea. I think if you've got any kind of experimental kind of work that you're not certain is going to sell well, if you're already a fairly established author, I definitely think that it would be a good idea for you to maybe use a pseudonym, because you want to see how that story goes under a different name than something that's already been established, which, like I said earlier in this video, when looking at the Wikipedia page in regards to his pen name, that was kind of the idea he wanted to see. He wanted to see, as part of an experiment, whether this book would sell better if it was written under a different name that nobody seemed to know, rather than being published under his real name, which, funny enough, didn't seem to work out the way he had hoped, because once people realized he was Bachman, Stephen King actually sold way, way, way more copies of this than it did in its original publishing. I think in general, the reception of this was pretty okay. I'm going to look back up the Wikipedia page for this, because I want to see kind of like what the reception of this was at the time, and what exactly are some themes and stuff that discuss this that I think would help with going more in depth with this review portion of the video. Apparently in 2000, the American Library Association listed it as one of the 100 best books for teenage readers published between 1966 and 2000. Teenagers, that's interesting, because it is, a teenage-based story. It's all about 16-year-old boys going through this, but I would not say that this is for teenagers. This is a little bit too gory, I think, for some adults. Like, I was very squeamish in a lot of these parts, and I'm not very sensitive to a lot of stuff anymore, so that's kind of surprising that this would be marketed for teenage readers. Apparently, this is the first novel he wrote, having begun it in 1966 to 67 during his freshman year at the University of Maine before he published Carrie. Now, I had thought that Salem's Lot was his first book he had ever tried to write, but I guess that's not true. The Long Walk is technically the first one he wrote. So as far as adaptations, apparently there was an approach to create a film adaptation of this in 1988 by George A. Romero, and it never happened. And then in 2007, Frank Darabont had secured the rights to the film adaptation of the novel, saying he would get it done one day, and had planned to make it low budget, weird, existential, and very self-contained. And I guess that maybe had never happened. It doesn't say anything about how the fact that it did happen or not, because then in 2018, in April, it was announced that New Line Cinema would develop a film adaptation because Darabont's rights to the film had lapsed, and James Vanderbilt had stepped in to write and produce the film with Bradley Fisher and William Sherrick of the Mythology Entertainment Production Company. And then in May 21st, 2019, a New Line had announced that Andre Overdahl would direct the adaptation. No idea as to whether or not that's going to actually happen or not. It may still be technically in production, and because of COVID, it's possible that it got pushed back. I had not heard anything about an adaptation of this to my knowledge, so I have no clue whether or not there is going to be a movie or anything with that. This Wikipedia page does not have anything in terms of how this book was received when it was published. It also doesn't go into anything about the themes or anything. It just basically goes into, the Wikipedia page goes into like the overall plot and the story, and then it goes into the individual characters. So that it goes into like the whole, plot of the story in general, then the actual story itself, kind of what really happens with it, and then it goes into the individual characters. That's basically it. So what are my basic thoughts on this? Now, I think it's good. I think it's definitely a very experimental work for King, and probably is why, like I said, he wrote under a different name. I think that it's very slow, but it's something that has to be slow given the content. The book itself is only 391 pages, which is kind of small in terms of a lot of King's work in the past and leading up to this point. This is kind of one of his shorter books, but it does fly by, I think, fairly quickly. Like, as much as I would say it's a slow book, I felt like I flew flew through chapters of it fairly quickly, and I really enjoyed the entire time I had with it. I will say again, the dialogue is not necessarily my favorite part of it. I think that this succumbs to a lot of King's possible drug use and alcohol abuse that he had in the 70s and the 80s, because the dialogue is very disjointed, it's random, it goes into very strange topics that I do not think the normal individual would go into in these kinds of scenarios. At the same time, you do see though the regression of characters as time goes on, the further and further they get into this competition. So some of the dialogue in terms of how disjointed it is does make sense, because these characters basically go insane as they're going through this, because it kind of, this monotony and this physical exertion they're going through pretty much fries their brains in a lot of ways. So it does make sense to a certain extent that there's a very disjointed dialogue, but at first it seems very strange. So I would go into it with that mindset as well, that it does seem very odd. And I will say too, I think that one of the drawbacks with this is we don't really get much of a reason as to why these characters are doing what they're doing. It's just kind of, they all have their own reasons, they're keeping it to themselves, which I respect, because a lot of them, like, we only see the perspective of Ray Garrity, but even with Ray, we don't really get a full on idea. I think that that's one of the biggest drawbacks of this, if I was to pick anything that I feel like I would have liked to know more about, because especially with Ray, we do understand, like I said, that he has a girlfriend, he does have some kind of family. Mostly I think it's just his mom, because he says that his brother died when he was younger and his dad was taken away by the government as for some reason, but we don't really understand why he's going through the walk. We do know that he was pulled into it as for some reason, which, because there's some kind of drafting process of some kind, that's not really fully explored. And so I do wish that there was something more regarding that, just because I feel like it would have added to the story a little bit more to understand why Ray has put himself in this position, if it was his choice at all, and why exactly all of these boys get put into this position. How did we get to the point where we live in a world where this competition happens every year, and that 100 boys are basically walking to their deaths in order to obtain some big prize that basically is the equivalent of anything that they could ever ask for, and then some. So I feel like this is just, it's a good story by itself, but there are things that I wish would have been possibly explained more. King probably has in his mind ideas as to why these things happen, but it's not often that you see the reasons why these are happening. It's not very often you will read a book and fully understand the world of it, because King wants you to draw conclusions of your own. He wants you in a lot of ways with a lot of his books to come up with your own ideas as to why things are happening the way they are, especially in these kind of dystopian, supernatural, or even sci-fi like stories that he creates, because he doesn't want to like put everything out there for you. He's one of those people where he's going to like give you the story and then you kind of come up with your own thing with it as you read, because that's kind of how the imagination works. We get a kind of stimulus that creates an idea and then we kind of go on from there. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that King continues to do in several of his other books that I've read over the course of my life. So all in all, The Long Walk gets a 4 out of 5 stars from me. I think it's a really good book. I think it's interesting to see this in a different light, considering that this is his first psychological horror, dystopian horror, and considering how he wrote it under a different name, how this is a very experimental work for him, given his past catalog up to this point. So I think, though, if you're looking to get into King, I think this might be one of the ones I say you could start off with, because it gives you a good idea of his writing. It gives you a good idea of how messed up his writing could be, and I think it doesn't really affect anything about how any of his other books are. I think this is another one that, because it's a standalone, it works very well as a great introductory work into King without being also one super intimidating with the length, because this is under 400 pages and the concept is not necessarily so complicated that you have to be fully aware of what's happening as things are going, because the whole story is basically this kind of fog almost. It's almost like you're watching things happen and everything kind of in a foggy sense of state, because that's kind of the whole point of the story. So if you guys have read The Long Walk yourself, I would love to hear your thoughts, whether you loved it or you hated it, what your thoughts are in terms of any of the motivations, in terms of characters, and what you thought about with the way things had gone in the story. If you could keep things as spoiler free as possible for other viewers that have not really read the book themselves, please do so. Otherwise, I will chat with you guys in the comments below about your guys' thoughts. I'd love to have some awesome conversations about this. But anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.